Eleanor Ellie Carter, driving through the dense, fog-shrouded forests of Vermont. The trees loom like skeletal hands, their branches clawing at the gray sky. Ellie's car radio crackles with static, and she switches it off, leaving only the sound of the engine and the occasional caw of a crow. The isolation of the landscape mirrors her emotional state, haunted by guilt over her younger brother's death, and driven by a desperate need to uncover the truth about Lila Harper's disappearance. Ellie's internal monologue reveals her motivation. She's a journalist who specializes in cold cases, but this one feels personal. Lila's photo, which Ellie keeps on her dashboard, shows a bright-eyed girl with a gap-toothed smile. Ellie sees her brother in that smile, and it fuels her determination. As she approaches Black Hollow, the town sign comes into view, a weathered wooden board with peeling paint. The population number has been scratched out, and someone has spray-painted a yellow symbol beneath the town's name, a crude circle with jagged lines radiating outward. Ellie frowns but dismisses it as graffiti. The town is eerily quiet, with boarded-up storefronts and empty streets. Ellie checks into a small motel on the edge of town, but the owner, Mrs. Grady, is visibly uneasy when Ellie mentions Lila's case. "Some things are best left buried," Mrs. Grady mutters, handing Ellie the key to her cabin. The cabin is a rustic, isolated structure nestled in the woods, a mile from the town center. As Ellie unpacks, she notices the air feels heavy, almost oppressive. The walls are bare except for a single painting of a forest scene, the trees oddly distorted, their branches forming shapes that seem almost human. That night, as Ellie sits at the small wooden desk reviewing her notes, she hears a faint scratching at the door. She freezes, her heart pounding. The scratching stops, but when she opens the door, there's no one there, just a faint, glowing yellow handprint on the wood. Ellie touches the handprint, and it feels warm, almost alive. She quickly wipes it away with a rag, but the moment she turns her back, she hears a child's laughter outside. It's high-pitched and playful, but sends a chill down her spine. Li steps outside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The laughter seems to come from all directions, echoing through the trees. She scans the area and spots something on the doorstep, a small, yellow-painted doll. Its face is cracked and worn, but its eyes seem to glint in the flashlight's beam. Against her better judgment, Ellie picks up the doll. Its head suddenly jerks to the side, and its mouth opens, emitting a raspy whisper. "Help me!" Ellie drops the doll in shock, her breath coming in short gasps. She kicks it into the woods and retreats inside, locking the door behind her. Ellie wakes to the sound of birds chirping, the morning light streaming through the cabin's windows. For a moment, she convinces herself it was all a nightmare. But as she steps outside to get some fresh air, she sees it, the doll, sitting perfectly upright on the doorstep, its head tilted as if staring at her. The yellow handprint is back on the door, brighter than before. Ellie walking into the Black Hollow Public Library, a crumbling brick building with ivy crawling up its walls. The air inside is thick with the scent of old paper and dust. The librarian, Ms. Abigail Finch, is an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a guarded demeanor. When Ellie mentions Lila's disappearance, Ms. Finch's expression darkens. "Some stories are better left untold," she says, but Ellie persists, flashing her press credentials. Ms. Finch reluctantly directs Ellie to the local history section, a dimly lit corner of the library filled with yellowed newspapers, handwritten journals, and faded photographs. As Ellie begins her research, she notices a strange symbol carved into the wooden desk she's using, a circle with jagged lines, identical to the one she saw on the town sign. While flipping through an old newspaper, Ellie accidentally knocks over a stack of books. As she picks them up, she notices a small, almost imperceptible seam in the desk's surface. Curious, she presses it, and a hidden compartment springs open. Inside is a single, yellowed envelope. The envelope is addressed to Eleanor Carter, in elegant, spidery handwriting. Ellie's heart skips a beat. How could someone have known she would come here? She opens the letter and reads, "Eleanor Carter, leave Black Hollow at once. Your curiosity will be your undoing. The yellow-painted man is no mere legend. He is a curse, a shadow that feeds on guilt and despair. If you stay, you will suffer the same fate as the others. Do not seek the truth. It will consume you. Ezekiel Crane. The letter is dated over a century ago. Ellie shows the letter to Ms. Finch, who pales at the sight of it. "Where did you find this?" she demands, her voice trembling. When Ellie explains, Ms. Finch glances around nervously, as if afraid someone, or something, might be listening. "Ezekiel Crane was a painter," Ms. Finch says, lowering her voice. "He lived here in the 1800s. After his daughter died, he went mad. He began painting himself in yellow, claiming it would protect him from the evil he believed haunted this town. But the more he painted, the more people died. They say he became the very thing he feared." Ms. Finch refuses to say more, but as Ellie leaves the library, she notices the librarian hastily locking the doors behind her. Back at her cabin, Ellie examines the letter again. She notices a faint stain on the corner, yellow paint. As she holds it up to the light, she sees a photograph tucked inside the envelope. It's an old family portrait, a man, a woman, and a young girl. The man is Ezekiel Crane, his face gaunt and haunted. The girl is his daughter, her eyes wide and fearful. But what chills Ellie to the bone is the figure in the background. A man painted entirely in yellow, his face obscured, but his presence unmistakable. The photograph seems to shift as Ellie stares at it, the yellow-painted man's eyes appearing to lock onto hers. She drops the photo, and when she picks it up, the figure is gone. That night, Ellie is awakened by the sound of her phone ringing. It's the sheriff, Tom Grady, informing her that Ms. Finch has been found dead in the library. Her body was discovered slumped over the desk where Ellie found the letter, her hands covered in yellow paint. Ellie rushes to the library where a small crowd has gathered. The sheriff pulls her aside and shows her a note found clutched in Ms. Finch's hand. It reads, "He's here." Ellie venturing into the woods near her cabin, determined to follow the trail of yellow symbols she's been seeing. The forest is dense and oppressive, the trees towering like silent sentinels. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Ellie's flashlight cuts through the growing darkness, but the beam feels feeble against the encroaching shadows. As she walks deeper into the woods, she notices more yellow symbols painted on trees and rocks. They seem to form a path, leading her towards something. Or someone. The symbols grow more intricate as she progresses, their jagged lines twisting into shapes that resemble faces, screaming mouths, and outstretched hands. Ellie's flashlight catches the outline of a small, dilapidated shack hidden among the trees. The structure is barely standing, its wooden planks warped and splintered. The door hangs crookedly on its hinges, and the windows are shattered, their jagged edges glinting in the dim light. As Ellie approaches, she hears a faint sound, a child's voice whispering her name. Her heart pounds as she steps inside. The interior is dark and cluttered with broken furniture and debris. In the center of the room is a small table, and on it sits a doll, the same yellow-painted doll she found on her doorstep. Ellie picks up the doll, and its head jerks to the side, its cracked lips parting to whisper, "Help me." She drops it in shock, but before she can react, she hears footsteps behind her. She turns, and there he is, the yellow-painted man. The figure is tall and gaunt, his entire body covered in dried yellow paint. His face is obscured by a mask of the same color, but his eyes, deep, hollow pits, seem to pierce through her. He doesn't move or speak, but his presence is overwhelming, filling the shack with a suffocating sense of dread. Ellie's flashlight flickers and dies, plunging the room into darkness. When the light returns, the figure is gone. She stumbles out of the shack, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and runs back to her cabin. When Ellie returns to her cabin, she finds the door slightly ajar. Inside, the room is in disarray. Her notes, photographs, and research materials are scattered across the floor. But as she looks closer, she realizes they've been arranged into a perfect replica of the yellow symbols she's been seeing. In the center of the arrangement is a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in yellow paint. "You're getting closer." Ellie hears a faint whisper, so soft it might be her imagination. "Help me." She spins around, but the room is empty. Ellie driving to Martha Harper's cabin, located on the outskirts of Black Hollow. The cabin is even more isolated than Ellie's, surrounded by dense woods and shrouded in an eerie silence. The air is heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound is the crunch of gravel under Ellie's boots as she approaches the front door. Ellie knocks, but there's no answer. The door creaks open slightly, revealing a dimly lit interior. She calls out Martha's name, but the only response is the faint echo of her own voice. Ellie steps inside, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The cabin is cluttered with old furniture, dusty books, and jars of preserves. On the walls are more of the yellow symbols, painted with meticulous care. In the living room, Ellie finds Martha's body slumped in a chair. Her eyes are wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and her hands are covered in dried yellow paint. A half-finished painting rests on an easel beside her, a depiction of the yellow-painted man, his hollow eyes seeming to follow Ellie as she moves. Ellie's stomach churns as she notices the faint smell of decay. She pulls out her phone to call the sheriff, but the screen goes black before she can dial. She tries to turn it back on, but it's completely dead. As Ellie turns to leave, she hears the front door slam shut. She rushes to it, but the handle won't budge. It's locked from the inside. Panic sets in as she tries the windows, but they're sealed shut, their panes covered in a thick layer of yellow paint. The scratching begins softly at first, like the sound of fingernails on wood. It grows louder, more insistent, coming from all around her. Ellie spins around, her flashlight darting across the walls, but there's nothing there. The scratching becomes a rhythmic pounding, as if something is trying to break through. Desperate, Ellie searches for another way out. She finds a small back window in the kitchen, its glass also covered in yellow paint. Using a chair, she smashes the window and climbs through, cutting her hand on the jagged edges. As she stumbles into the backyard, she hears the scratching stop. The woods are silent, the only sound her ragged breathing. She looks back at the cabin and freezes. There, standing at the tree line, is the yellow-painted man. He doesn't move, doesn't speak. His hollow eyes seem to bore into hers, and for a moment, Ellie feels an overwhelming sense of despair. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he's gone, vanishing into the shadows. With Ellie sitting at her desk, her hands trembling as she reviews her notes, the events at Martha's cabin have left her shaken, and she's barely slept. The cabin feels different now, colder, darker, as if the walls themselves are closing in. The yellow symbols she's been seeing seem to glow faintly in the dim light, their jagged lines twisting into shapes that make her headache. Ellie's phone buzzes, startling her. It's a text from her editor, Mark. "I'm in town. We need to talk." She sighs, dreading the confrontation, but knowing she can't avoid it. Mark arrives at the cabin, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. He's a no-nonsense man in his late 40s, with a sharp wit and a protective streak when it comes to Ellie. He's been her mentor for years, but their relationship has been strained since she took on the Lila Harper case. "You look like hell," Mark says as he steps inside. Ellie doesn't argue. She knows she's been pushing herself too hard, but she can't stop. Not now. Mark tries to convince Ellie to drop the story and return to the city. "This town is toxic," he says. "You're chasing ghosts, Ellie, literally." Ellie fires back, her voice rising. "This isn't just a story, Mark. People are dying. Lila's still out there, and I'm the only one who cares enough to find her." The argument escalates, both of them shouting over each other. Mark grabs her arm, trying to shake some sense into her, but Ellie pulls away, her eyes blazing. Suddenly, Mark doubles over, clutching his chest. Ellie's anger turns to panic as he collapses to the floor, coughing violently. She kneels beside him, trying to help, but what comes out of his mouth isn't blood, it's yellow paint. Mark's eyes widen in terror as he chokes, the paint spilling from his lips and staining his hands. He grabs Ellie's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "He's in you!" he gasps, his voice barely audible. Then, his body goes limp. Ellie stares in horror, her mind struggling to process what just happened. She stumbles to the bathroom, her hands shaking as she scrubs the paint from her skin. But when she looks in the mirror, she notices something. yellow paint under her fingernails, as if she's been digging in it. Ellie calls the sheriff, but by the time he arrives, the paint is gone. There's no trace of it on Mark's body or the floor. The sheriff gives her a suspicious look, but Ellie is too exhausted to argue. Alone in the cabin, Ellie sits on the floor, staring at her hands. The words, "He's in you," echo in her mind. She remembers the letter from Ezekiel Crane, the photograph, the doll, and the yellow-painted man's hollow eyes. She pulls out her notes and begins to write, her handwriting frantic. The yellow-painted man isn't just a legend, he's a curse, and I think he's chosen me. Ellie entering the black, hollow town archives, a dimly lit basement beneath the town hall. The air is thick with the smell of mildew and old paper. Shelves line the walls, crammed with dusty boxes, ledgers, and artifacts from the town's history. Ellie is determined to uncover the truth about Ezekiel Crane and the yellow-painted man, hoping it will explain the horrors she's been experiencing. The archivist, Mr. Harold Greeley, is a frail man in his 70s with a nervous disposition. He eyes Ellie warily, but reluctantly agrees to help her. "You're not the first to come looking for answers," he says, his voice trembling. "But you might be the last." Ellie spends hours sifting through documents, finding little of use. Just as she's about to give up, Mr. Greeley hands her a small, rusted canister. "This might be what you're looking for," he says. Inside is an old film reel labeled Ezekiel Crane, 1879. Ellie sets up a projector in a corner of the archives, her hands shaking with anticipation. The film begins with grainy, flickering footage of Black Hollow in the late 19th century. The town looks much the same, though the people wear outdated clothing and move with the jerky motions of early cinema. As the film progresses, Ellie's heart skips a beat. The camera pans to a woman standing in front of the town hall, a woman who looks exactly like her. The woman interacts with townspeople, her movements eerily familiar. Ellie's breath quickens as she realizes the woman is her. The film cuts to a scene in the woods where the woman, Ellie, is painting yellow symbols on trees. The camera zooms in on her face, revealing a look of desperation and fear. Then the screen flickers and the yellow-painted man appears behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The woman turns to look at him, her expression one of resignation, before the film abruptly ends. Ellie sits in stunned silence, her mind racing. Mr. Greeley approaches, his face pale. "I told you," he says, his voice barely above a whisper. The yellow-painted man isn't just a legend. He's a cycle, a curse that repeats itself. And you're part of it now. Ellie demands answers, but Mr. Greeley refuses to say more. "Leave while you still can," he says, his eyes filled with pity. "Before it's too late." As Ellie leaves the archives, she notices a door she hadn't seen before. It's slightly ajar, and a faint yellow light spills from the crack. Against her better judgment, she pushes the door open and steps inside. The room is small and windowless, its walls covered in yellow symbols. In the center is a pedestal with an old leather-bound book. Ellie opens it and finds handwritten entries, each one detailing the life of a person who encountered the yellow-painted man. The last entry is hers, written in her own handwriting, though she has no memory of writing it. Ellie in her cabin, surrounded by candles, herbs, and the old leather-bound book she found in the archives. The book contains instructions for a ritual to banish the yellow-painted man, but it comes with a warning. Only the chosen may perform this rite, and the price is steep. Ellie's hands tremble as she arranges the items on the floor, forming a circle of yellow symbols. She knows the risks. Mr. Greeley's warning echoes in her mind, but she has no choice. The entity is growing stronger, and she can feel its presence creeping into her thoughts, her dreams, even her reflection. As Ellie begins the ritual, the air in the cabin grows heavy, and the candles flicker unnaturally. She recites the incantation from the book, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The symbols on the floor begin to glow. casting an eerie yellow light that fills the room. Suddenly, the ground beneath her seems to shift, and the cabin dissolves into darkness. Ellie feels herself falling, tumbling through a void filled with whispers and distant screams. Ellie lands in a twisted version of Black Hollow. The sky is a sickly yellow, and the trees are gnarled and blackened, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. The town is empty, the buildings crumbling and covered in yellow paint. The air smells of decay and burning sulfur. As Ellie walks through the streets, she hears a faint voice calling her name. She follows it to the town square, where she finds Lila Harper, alive and unharmed. Lila looks exactly as she did in the photos, bright-eyed and smiling, but there's something off about her, something Ellie can't quite place. Lila approaches Ellie, her expression calm but sad. "You don't understand," she says. "He's not what you think. He's not a monster. He's a guardian." Ellie is stunned. "A guardian of what?" "Of the balance," Lila replies. "He takes the guilty, the ones who can't escape their past. But he also protects the innocent. That's why I'm here. He's keeping me safe." Before Ellie can respond, shadowy figures emerge from the darkness, their forms shifting and indistinct. They grab Lila, dragging her away as she screams for Ellie to help her. Ellie tries to chase after Lila, but the ground beneath her feet cracks and splits, forcing her to stop. The yellow-painted man appears before her, his hollow eyes fixed on hers. The air grows colder, and the whispers around her become deafening. "You cannot escape," the entity says, its voice a chorus of whispers. "You are part of this now." Ellie tries to complete the ritual, reciting the incantation from memory, but the entity's presence is overwhelming. The ground shakes, and the sky above her fractures like glass. Ellie wakes up in her cabin, the candles extinguished, and the symbols on the floor smudged. Her head is pounding, and her hands are covered in yellow paint. She looks in the mirror and sees the yellow-painted man standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder. When she turns, he's gone, but the reflection remains. Ellie standing in the nightmarish version of Black Hollow, the sky a sickly yellow and the air thick with the scent of decay. The town is eerily silent, the buildings crumbling and covered in yellow paint. The ground beneath her feet is cracked and uneven, and the trees loom like twisted sentinels. Ellie knows this is her last chance to confront the yellow-painted man and end the curse. She clutches the leather-bound book tightly, the incantation for the ritual fresh in her mind. As she walks through the desolate streets, she hears faint whispers, the voices of the town's guilty souls echoing around her. Ellie reaches the town square, where the yellow-painted man stands waiting for her. His hollow eyes lock onto hers, and the air grows colder. The whispers grow louder, forming a cacophony of guilt and despair. "You cannot win," the entity says, its voice a chorus of whispers. "You are part of this now." Ellie stands her ground, her voice trembling but determined. "I'm not afraid of you. I know what you are, a manifestation of guilt, a curse on this town, and I'm going to end it." The yellow-painted man tilts his head, his expression unreadable. "You misunderstand. I am not the curse. I am the consequence. The town's sins created me, and I am bound to them. But you have a choice." The entity steps closer, its presence overwhelming. "You can banish me, but the town will be forced to face its sins. The guilt will consume them, and they will destroy themselves. Or you can let me continue to feed, sparing the town but condemning yourself. The choice is yours." Ellie's mind races. She thinks of Lila, of Martha, of Mark, and all the others who have suffered because of the curse. She thinks of her own guilt, the weight of her brother's death pressing down on her. Ellie makes her choice. She recites the incantation from the book, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The symbols on the ground begin to glow, and the yellow-painted man's form starts to dissolve. "You cannot escape," the entity says, its voice fading. "You are part of this now." As the entity disappears, Ellie feels a strange sensation, as if something is shifting inside her. She looks down at her hands and sees yellow paint spreading across her skin. Ellie realizes the truth. She has become the new vessel for the yellow-painted man. The curse is not broken. It has simply passed to her. She feels the weight of the town's guilt pressing down on her, the whispers of the guilty souls filling her mind. The final scene shows Ellie in her cabin, standing in front of a mirror. She dips her hands into a can of yellow paint and begins to cover her body, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes glow with an unnatural light as she whispers, "It's my turn now.